my good friend, who also has not only great wisdom in the subject of immigration and social policies in this country, but certainly his understanding of Puerto Rico. I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutiérrez.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the rule and to the underlying bill. I submitted 10 amendments for consideration. Not one of them, not one of my amendments was ruled in order to be debated today by my colleagues. But I don't oppose the bill because I didn't get an amendment in here. The fact that my amendments were deemed unsuitable for debate by the Congress of the United States is an indication of the underlying problems with the bill. If you can't debate the future of Puerto Rico here in the Congress of the United States, imagine when you give it to 7 people unelected by anyone here in Puerto Rico or in the United States that can meet in secret. They can meet in secret without informing us of any one of their decisions. If we can't have a debate about Puerto Rico, if it's so important, why not take time to have a debate about the amendments that are offered by people here? We're engaged today in a wholly undemocratic activity in the world's greatest democracy. We're debating how we will take power from the people who are virtually powerless already. As I have said throughout this debate, Puerto Rico, by virtue of court cases and the territorial clause of the Constitution, belongs to, but is not a part of the United States. I say to all of my colleagues, treat them with dignity, with respect. Do not put blinders on as though they do not exist. Yes, the territorial clause of the Constitution of the United States says that they are territory and that therefore they are property of the United States of America. But I submit to each and every one of you that they are live human beings with hearts, with souls, and should demand and receive the respect that any other human. Don't treat them like a piece of trash. Don't treat them like an inanimate object that has no right to dignity and to respect, which is what we are doing here today. I cannot vote for this. You know, President Obama referred to the special place that Kenya owns in his heart, because he says, it will always be a special place because that is the place of the birth of my father, he says. Let me submit to you, Puerto Rico is the place of the birth of my father. And I cannot come here and turn my back on the place of the birth of my father with this outrageously undemocratic and this outrageously unfair proposal to the people of Puerto Rico. Think about it. You are imposing a junta, because that's what they're calling it. There will be no difference between this junta and the junta of Pinochet in Chile, as far as the international community is concerned. And why? Because yesterday, and the Speaker of the House of Puerto Rico is in the gallery, they approved a resolution rejecting this junta, elected by the people of Puerto Rico. And what does the Congress of the United States, the democracy of the world, say? We don't care. Today, as we speak, the Senate in Puerto Rico has a resolution rejecting. And just this past Sunday, every candidate for governor in Puerto Rico, every last candidate for governor in Puerto Rico that was successful, had in their platform a rejection of PROMESA. How many times do the people of Puerto Rico have to reject this proposal so that the Congress of the United States treats them with some respect and some dignity? And I just want to say, control board? When's the last control board we know so much about? Flint, Michigan. And what did the control board do? They poisoned the people, American citizens in Flint. And let me suggest to you that if you give power to a control board unelected and unsupervised by anyone here, be careful. Be careful. Remember Flint. Remember the poisoning of the people, what the control board did there. That is exactly what we should suspect will happen unless we put. People say, oh, Luis, but what's your alternative? Our alternative is quite simple. Have a conversation. Not a conversation that begins, we will not spend a penny on the people of Puerto Rico. That's the way our conversation will be. We will not. You have to show me a solution in which we do not spend a penny. Well, let me tell you, we spend money. The Jones Act imposed on the people of Puerto Rico, the most expensive merchant marines in the world, imposed on the people, cost $500 million a year. Why don't we lift that from them? I mean, we believe in democracy. We believe they should be free. Why don't we lift that from them? Medicaid and Medicare? Have you seen the reimbursement schedules to Puerto Rico? They pay the same in FICA taxes, but don't receive the same in terms of reimbursement. In 2006, the wisdom of this Congress was to say to the people of Puerto Rico, we don't care that you're going to lose hundreds of thousands of jobs. We're eliminating Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code that created jobs. The people of Puerto Rico want jobs. They want jobs, and they want jobs, and they want the dignity and the respect that comes with being American citizens of this nation.
I yield the gentleman an
The gentleman is
additional 1 minute.
recognized for an additional 1 minute.
And they demand the dignity and the respect that comes. They don't come here on their knees. They are a proud people. They are a people who want to use their creativity and their energy. But this Congress of the United States has said they're a colony. I didn't say that. The Committee on Natural Resources says we have plenary powers over the people of Puerto Rico. I didn't say that. You said that. If you have plenary powers over the people of Puerto Rico, then assume your responsibility that come with those plenary powers over the people of Puerto Rico. And please, don't tell me you're going to put Puerto Ricans on the board. I lived in Puerto Rico. I remember when the sugarcane cutters would cut the sugarcane. Let me assure you, there were Puerto Ricans in charge of exploiting those workers in the sugarcane fields. There have been many times in history when the very same people have been put in charge to exploit their own. Give us dignity, give us transparency. Do it at least in the Spanish language so that people can know what's going on in their own. At least King George, when he would come with his decrees before he burned this building down, would write his decrees in English so that we would understand what he was doing.
Has expired. Members are reminded and requested not to refer to our guests in the gallery. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr.